I propose to split it into three areas, 3 rounds. One would be devoted to tariffs and business. Second one would be devoted to defense and security and future of NATO and Atlantic security cooperation. And third one, something about shared values. And let me introduce the panelists. Next to me, welcome Cameron Munter, is a former US diplomat, former ambassador, currently happily retired and consulting in various businesses in Prague. Welcome. Roman Joch from Občanský Institute is also working at several universities. Welcome, Roman. George Hayes is a professor. To those of you who are studying here, I don't have to introduce him, but he was on our first panel before American elections, so it's nice to see you back. And we have Ondřej Jonáš, who is here in a partially schizophrenic role because he is a Czech investor, but he is also an American citizen, so sometimes, and it's interesting that he is looking at the stock market and financial markets from both sides, sometimes feeling like someone from Massachusetts, sometimes feeling like someone from Břevnov, so it's gonna be exciting, definitely. And last but not least, we have Drake Delay. Thanks, Drake, a lot. Drake is a student here from Anglo-American University, and we are excited to have you here. Okay, so I promised that we should first touch the tariff policy, and you don't need to be an economist or theoretical economist to be confused a little bit about it, not only about the fact how quickly everything is changing, but also about different goals which are being spoken about by different people, or sometimes by the very same people in Trump administration and his closest people and his closest advisors. Some people say that tariffs are being used as a kind of a geopolitical leverage, especially against rivals and adversaries. Second explanation is that tariffs are going to serve like a permanent source of income, which would replace some taxes, like a source of income from the American federal budget. Some people say that it's only supposed to balance the imbalances in international trade, and others I forgot actually, but at the moment, but it's it depends on who you listen to and when. So what's your take on tariffs, Cameron?
Thank you very much, Jan. And excuse me, it's Prague spring, which means I sneeze a lot. So, look, I agree very much with your assessment, which is that the definitions that the Trump administration, representatives of the Trump administration have made in trying to explain why the tariffs are being done in the way they are contradictory. And in fact, not only do they not match, they actually deeply contradict each other. You cannot build an American manufacturing base by using tariffs as a negotiating tool. One of the problems with Trump that many of you have seen, it's been argued about and written about endlessly, is that the American electorate and many of the people who support Trump read into Trump what they want to read into Trump. That is to say, when he says in the campaign, I will have tariffs and we will get rid of the federal income tax because we will make so much money the way we did in 1895, Some people say, that's what I want to see. I want to get rid of the federal income tax, so I'm for Trump. Other people see that he's going to do this as a negotiating tactic and get better terms of trade with those wicked Germans and those nasty Japanese and other people like that. And so those people who think that it would serve their interest to do these things accept that element of what he says. And then there are any number of other pronouncements he's made. You may have noticed that he is not consistent. So make no mistake, right? There is no strategy. There is no grand scheme. This is going to continue and it's going to get worse. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago and I noticed, forgive me if I say, that there I met with Republicans and I met with Democrats. And the Republicans have no balls and the Democrats have no ideas, right? And I am shocked by this because when I was a diplomat for 40 years, I expected coherence, especially in foreign policy. And for the most part, we got it. We got NATO enlargement. We got other kinds of things. We made lots of mistakes, but there was a coherence coming out of Washington. It is very incoherent. So I guess I'm just underscoring the point you made, which is there are many interpretations of how the tariffs will go. The twists and turns will depend on people telling you that their particular interests, whether it's taxation, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's negotiation, whether their particular interests are served. But Trump himself is not following a pattern. He will go until he runs into someone else or a new idea because he is not able to plan. The one thing that is significant that some people have noticed, the last point I'll make, is that he has talked about tariffs consistently for the last 40 years. And this is different than many other things. You know, he used to be for abortion and now he's against abortion. He used to be this, he used to be that. Tariffs are things that he has had a fixation with. So even though it won't be a coherent proposal, a set of proposals, it will continue. Tariffs are going to be something that we're going to see more of. And we haven't, I think, in my opinion, even seen the beginning of where the impact is going to fall.
Thank you. Roman? Is it
working? Thank you. Thank you. I agree with Cameron Munter, with Mr. Munter, that there is no grand super intelligent strategy behind Trump's tariffs policy. I agree that he has been a consistent protectionist since mid-80s, at least, of the 20th century. In 1987, he published an advertisement in major US newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, advocating for tariffs, especially against Japanese. The threat in the late 80s perceived in America in commercial relations was Japan. He has been consistent in believing that trade deficits with countries abroad, with foreign countries, are almost equivalent to stealing American wealth by foreigners. I myself am, all my economic education has convinced me that free trade is good for both partners. And imposing tariffs is like shooting own leg, shooting to one's own leg. Especially tariffs imposed on friendly neighboring countries like Canada, which could be considered a part of the American economy. So by imposing tariffs on, let us say, wood or aluminium from Canada, is making all goods in the US more expensive. Food, beverages, production of airplanes, for example. Tariffs on iron makes constructions more expensive. So it does not make sense from the economic point of view. Concerning negative trade relations with different countries, let us suppose that America needs some strategic minerals or commodities like uranium for weapon purposes and for a geostrategic competition, let us say with China, for example. There is a poor African country which has a lot of uranium. Americans would like to buy uranium for defense purposes. The country is poor, so it's not viable that inhabitants of that poor African country would buy a lot of American goods. They simply don't have the money. So the trade relationship with that country for America will always be negative. Does it make a sense for America to impose tariff on import of uranium from that African country? No, not at all. So it seems to me obvious that the conviction that if foreigners buy less than Americans from foreigners, that it's always bad for America. That's simply not a sustainable, viable position. That's the first point. The second point, is there any reason for tariffs? I would say yes. In special situations, there could be a case for tariffs, embargoes, for example, for strategic and defense purposes. It does not make sense to sell high-tech technologies or commodities to the enemies, like the Soviet Union in the 80s or the 70s. On the other hand, it does make no sense to be dependent of vital commodities like medicine from countries which could become enemies, to be completely dependent. During COVID pandemic, it was learned that about 90% of ingredients for antibiotics were imported from China to the US. That's not a safe position. To have chips, for example, from Eastern Asia and to be dependent on imports of chips for computers from Eastern Asia in the case of Chinese-Taiwanese conflict, that would not be a very prudent policy. So from geopolitical and defense purposes, I can see some reason for America, for the United States, to be not so dependent on China. That I can acknowledge as a something which could be achieved, but in that case, it's not necessary for America to be completely self-sufficient. It's necessary for America to have imports from other countries which are friendly or neutral towards the United States. So to declare a tariff war against almost the whole world was economically not very bright idea, with the exception of Russia, Belarus, North Korea, which were omitted from those tariffs. Now, that's the second point. So in some situations, tariffs could be prudent for defense and geostrategic purposes, even though they will not be economically useful, but defense is more important than wealth. And the last point, I agree that there is no phenomenal super intelligent strategy behind, because we see the changes in the policy. So April the 2nd, so-called Liberation Day, mammoth tariffs, huge tariffs imposed on almost all countries in the world. Even on Australia. By the way, America sells more to Australia than imports from Australia. And the tariff imposed on Australia was 10%. Israel, the state of Israel, has 0 tariffs on American goods. The tariff suggested on April the 2nd was 17% on Israeli commodities and goods. A week later, April the 9th, it was almost a week ago, a change of policy. I think that President Trump was under intense lobbying from some of his advisors, like Elon Musk, and some wealthy businessmen in the United States who saw that the policies imposed by, tariff policies imposed by Trump were harmful to American economy. So change, at least for 90 days. We shall see what will happen. No one from us knows. Definitely I don't know what will happen after 90 days or what could happen even during those 90 days. Then news from last week, was it, or beginning of this week, imports of iPhones, mostly from China, by the way, tariffs on them were suspended temporarily. So that was, in my view, lobbying from huge American companies like Apple and Dell, for example. Those companies could lobby President Trump. But what about small businesses? They have no such a leverage on President Trump. And then another version of that policy, the lowering or postponing on tariffs on iPhones was decided to be temporary. So we see zigzags almost on daily basis, at least on weekly basis. And what could happen now? Well, what allows President Trump to impose those tariffs arbitrarily? A law. The law, so-called International Emergency Economic Powers Act, passed by Congress in 1977 during Jimmy Carter presidency. 1977, it was after the oil shock in the first half of the 70s. It was an extreme measure, and it was used by following American presidents after Jimmy Carter against problematic countries or countries, regimes considered to be problematic, like Iran or Nicaragua during Sandinista regime. They have the same regime now. And even South Africa, Republic of South Africa, because of apartheid regime in those years in the 80s. But no one, I believe, among those congressmen and senators in 1977 who passed the bill, which became a law, imagined that there will come one day a president who will declare tariff wars against all countries in the world and create international economic emergency, in fact. So the solution is obvious. Congress should step in. Congress should step in and limit those tariff powers of American presidents, not only this one, but all American presidents. But President, of course, would veto such a bill. And it's not obvious that a sufficient majority, 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress will be available to overvote presidential veto. So I don't expect that to happen soon. Secondly, I think that President Trump has free time till summer of next year. If American economy tanks, goes down by summer of next year, Republican senators and all Republican congressmen, and Democratic, of course, as well, who will be up for re-election in November 26, will be in a mood of panic. And then we can expect a rebellion of his party in Congress, Republican congressmen and senators, against President Trump. But I don't think that will happen if the data show that economic results of Trump's tariffs are harmful to American economy. Trump will suppress his inclinations, his protectionist inclinations, listen more to advisors like Secretary of Finance Scott Bessent or Elon Musk or whomever else, and suspend those tariffs. But it seems to me those tariffs are not rational, and there is no phenomenal strategy behind them, just improvisation. Based on strong instincts by Trump that protectionism would be good. By the way, as a source of revenue, if those tariffs are high, few foreign companies will export goods to America. So what revenue? What revenue? Only minimal, only small. So that's my position or my thoughts on the question asked by Jan.
Thank you, Roman. George?
Thank you. I have a slightly different take. I think that there is some, maybe strategy is too strong a word, but I think there's something behind Trump's behavior. I think the issue is what we'd call level of analysis. as a representative of the United States who should be operating in the interest of the United States, there is clearly no strategy, at least nothing that's going to successfully benefit the United States. But I don't think that's how Trump is operating. I think that there are two more or less rational reasons behind what he's doing. The first is, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, he promised he was going to do it. And so he can point to, this is another campaign promise that I have successfully fulfilled. You wanted it, I have given it to you. If you don't like it now, implicitly it's your fault. But I didn't keep anything from you. And secondly, as was mentioned just now, he has the unilateral power to do it, and that interests him. He likes that. He likes things that are demonstrations of power with him at the middle, and that don't have a whole lot of strings attached. He can print off a giant poster and go outside and then make the world dance. And I think that this is something that he enjoys. So in terms of some kind of national policy, absolutely, I agree. This doesn't make any kind of rational sense. There is no ultimate benefit, whether relative or absolute, that would come from it. I agree with all the points about tariffs that have been made. I think, though, that it kind of misses the point about who he is and what he's doing. At the same time, gives some degree of predictability that going forward, when there is something that he sees that he can do as an expression of power, he will do. I think that also, in some ways, it is slightly reassuring because he's also operating like someone who's not expecting to have to go to another election. That could be because he's planning on obeying the 2-term limits, or he's thinking about something else to keep from having to run into another election. But while he may not be concerned about elections, I agree that certainly the House Republicans are very much concerned. I wouldn't expect them to defect in the summer, in the lead up to the votes, to Election Day. I would expect, if anything, there to start to be some kind of distancing, gentle distancing after the elections, assuming that he's going to be a lame duck, and starting to see who is in the mix to, again, as quietly as possible, try to put themselves forward as a successor. Whether it's Vance or whether it's some other up-and-comer, I think that attention will start to shift to the message that they are leading with. But yes, as long as the law is on the books and Trump can make use of it, I think that he will, without any other greater necessary reason than on that day he decides that it's beneficial to do so for his own interest and entertainment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Ondřej, I know that you were not that 100% negative about everything, or you were thinking about some possible successes, especially about particular companies coming back to US and start new production lines there, like Apple and Nvidia, etc. Am I right, or are you? Because we speak frequently informally, so maybe you already changed your mind, but it's up to you, obviously.
Well, I don't disagree with anything that has been said so far, including by you. I am very close to this political analysis because I think the political take is much more
closer to the microphone. Okay.
The political angle, I think, is much more important than the economic one. There is not much sense one can make of tariffs, and I think they're used as a smokescreen for something quite different. Trump isn't so primitive as to insist on a balanced trade with every single country, so on a bilateral basis. Obviously, some of the examples that we have heard show that that is impossible and silly. However, what pains him is the overall deficit that the US is running and the debt. Annually, the deficit is close to $1 trillion. I think it's about between 700 and 900 billion a year, depending on the level of trade. and the total indebtedness is 43 or 44 trillion, and as interest rates rise, obviously servicing that debt is very painful, and today it costs more than the entire budget of the Defense Department. So I would also like to mention that there is a tax bill being debated in Congress right now, and Republicans expect quite a bit from that, specifically an extension of the existing tax cuts, but going beyond that. You may remember that during the election, there were certain promises not to tax Social Security, not to tax tips, lower tax rates across the board, and all of that stuff ends up adding up and costing money. So we have a prospect of a ballooning deficit in a situation which is already very, very difficult. The dollar is a reserve currency. I invite you to think through what that means. It means that when Germans send us BMWs and Mercedes cars, the Americans send back what? A piece of paper. It may start out being $1, it may then be invested in US treasuries or some other asset, but it's basically a claim against the United States. It turns out that over 70% of world trade is financed in dollars. So you need all that money outside of the United States for world trade to function. Somebody mentioned the oil crisis '72. I would go even further back. When Japan was exporting lots of cars to the United States, the Japanese, being great savers, were accumulating huge amounts of money, and that gave rise to something which is called the euro-dollar market, which is where I made my career, moving to London and essentially intermediating money from savers in Japan and then in the Middle East for use by the world community to finance trade. So today we have a situation where some 80% of contracts and financial instruments in the world are denominated in dollars. And that is both a privilege, and I suspect there are people in the audience who might claim that it is a privilege, but it's also a burden. And during the last 2 weeks, you saw what the reaction can be on markets when people lose faith, and basically the credibility of the dollar is put to the test. We had a market that fell, what, 10%, maybe 12% on the NASDAQ. Interest rates on US Treasuries jumped by 70 basis points. That's 0.7%. And Trump broke down. Trump backed off and said, maybe, you know, these tariffs are not the greatest idea. And so he extended by 90 days the start date on these tariffs. And as I said at the beginning, I don't think his aim is tariffs at all. His aim is something quite a bit different, and that is to reorder the world trade and the rules under which it operates, because he feels that it disadvantages the US. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but maybe we can get into it if you want.
Thank you. Maybe in the debate, but there is also definitely, like we didn't mention everything, there are people, and somehow it's becoming very popular in this country from some paradoxical reasons. We know that, for instance, Václav Klaus, former president, published an article in MF yesterday, I think, or the day before yesterday, explaining that Trump would save international trade. Then we had a second article by some guy from Prague School of Economics explaining that EU is guilty with value-added tax and Americans are right to punish Europeans for value-added tax. But with all these people who are somehow explaining this like mysterious, like logical scheme behind it, they also believe that there is some very sophisticated plan to devalue the dollar simultaneously with tariffs. Before I give a floor to Drake, what's your take, Ondřej, on this dollar devaluation plan connected with tariffs? Please, very briefly.
Well, you started an interesting story. We should think about it. I think the parallel with 1972 is a good one. Certainly, a devaluation of the dollar would solve some of the tensions in the system. And you see that the market has been pushing that way in the last 2 weeks. Today, the euro is trading at 113, 114. It was at 105, 106 before then. And what was very bizarre, what surprised me, was that the dollar fell and interest rates in US dollars went up at the same time. Typically, when interest rates go up in the 10-year, it means that it's more attractive to invest in US Treasuries. And here, for the first time, exactly the opposite happened. So most people interpret that as sensitivity or nervousness about the possible consequences. I must say what surprised me is that Trump really gave up after a drop of 10%, which really was just eliminating the last 7 months of growth.
So he didn't exactly give up. We shouldn't forget that what Mirek Singer, who is not here today but comes on these discussions, often says, like, we shouldn't forget that these 10% tariffs are in place and no one is even...
Well, unless you export fentanyl, in which case it's 20%.
Okay.
I don't know what category you might be in.
Okay, Drake.
Well, that's a really good starting point for me, coming off the fentanyl comment.
Please speak more to this.
Better? Okay. I think from a standpoint of a non-academic, like everyone else here, I think that the world is scary. And I think that moving forward in the future, tariffs not only have a negative and, as everyone else has said, non-consistent path, it also fuels despair. We saw before the 90-day pause by President Trump, stocks rose. The S&P 500 had its best days since October 2008, which preceded the Great Depression. So if anyone is following the market, you would think it would be President Trump, the man that invested, did everything, followed the money essentially, and yet he's doing everything to counteract that. And I think that the main purpose that I've kind of gathered from this is the ripple effect. I think that as we kind of touched upon this, elections are coming up. Midterms are less than a year and a half away. I think that there isn't going to be an outright defect like George has said, but I also don't think that there's going to be a distancing. I think that Trump has full control of the Republican Party. I recently read a foreign affairs article about the authoritarian entrenchment of the United States. And since 2014, the United States has democratically backslided. It has, without a doubt, removed civil liberties, removed civil protections, and I do not think that the ruling, if we can put that in parentheses, party, is going to do anything about that in 2026, and I highly doubt in 2028. And the tariffs are, I think, fueling a lot of generational anger. As someone who does invest in stocks myself, last week and the week prior were very nervous times. And Thursday, when the news came of 90-day pause, I was very happy. But I think for the lot of people that are currently getting into the stock market or are currently experiencing the economic impacts of international trade, liberalization, globalization, I think that there's going to be a very strong groundwork pushback on Trump and on Republicans. As Cameron said, Democrats have no ideas, Republicans have no balls. We will see if that changes. I completely agree with that statement, by the way. But at the end of the day, this 90 days will be kind of a testing experiment to see how these work, to see what the response is from everyday Americans. And at the end of the day, I honestly think that the end result will negatively harm America. It will negatively harm the world. And it's kind of like the old adage, you don't go waking up the bear. Trump kind of did that in 2016 through 2020 in his first administration. And I don't think that he's learned his lesson. So we'll see about the next 4 years.
Thank you very much, Drake. And I would like to now we can come back to this business and tariff questions during the discussion. But now I would continue with a second plan, which was to discuss NATO and defense cooperation. My first question would be: Is it in this atmosphere of having a trade war among allies, is it possible to keep unity and morale behind the common cause of allies? I'm a little bit myself worried that Trump has never, as far as I know, but I wasn't using like exactly search engine to find out, but I had never heard him myself to, especially in this term and in this campaign before he became president for the second time, to use a word ally. I'm afraid that it's not only in his vocabulary, it's probably not only in his mental capacity. We know that if there are some, through signal conversation or Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, if we can hear something emotionally negative from Trump and his closest aides, it's always about Europe or Ukraine. They don't speak so negatively about any other entities. But on the other hand, some important players like Marco Rubio says, don't worry, NATO is here to stay. We are not leaving NATO. You just need to pay 5%. But is it possible to keep defense partnership and NATO if it's, okay, it's a contract, it's on paper, but you should have some common morale behind it, some ethos behind it. I agree that in the past, when Europe was not fulfilling its task of spending for defense, it was too much speaking about values and virtue signaling, but there was not enough being done materially. But now it seems to me we are in the opposite extreme, because there must be something more than money and contract on the paper which keeps NATO together. So I'm a little bit nervous about it, quite a lot nervous about it. So what's your take on it, Cameron? Is Trump coming on June NATO summit? Like, would you bet on it?
It's very difficult to bet on what Trump will do, and so I won't bet on it. He might not. But NATO is not an organization. NATO is part of a philosophy that was developed after the Second World War. It's based on a premise that the expansion of relations among like-minded countries is a good thing. So that even though the Americans, through the years, we had a burden-sharing ambassador coming to talk to Europeans about paying more in 1980s, 1990s. We were talking about this a long time. There were many in the United States who did not take that seriously. I mean, we knew the Europeans didn't take it seriously. We didn't take it seriously. Why? Because the Americans also enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of having NATO do what America wanted. You don't have a Middle East policy in the United States if you don't have Ramstein Air Force Base to reinforce Israel. You don't have the kind of places to organize a global policy of alliances, and I'll get back to the word allies in a minute, unless you have Europe. So for all of the talk that we have said about, oh, the Europeans aren't paying their way, it wasn't until Trump came along that Americans really began to take that seriously. And Trump took it literally, you know, the old idea about seriously and literally. He took it literally. And because Trump is basically operating like a mafia don, he said, the shakedown here is, if you want this little nice Europe of yours to keep prospering, you're going to have to cough up. Fundamental misunderstanding of the entire 80 years since 1945. All right? Whether we like that or not, that is how he thinks. And because NATO is not just an organization that's based on tanks and airplanes and things of that sort, it's an organization based on faith. It's easy to make fun of NATO as a shop where people talk about common values shoulder to shoulder. I spent a lot of time in places like Iraq and Afghanistan with Danish and with Italian soldiers working together, and we all would talk about how we're all in this together, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of talk about that. But at the heart of NATO, the Article 5 guarantee is not an Article 5 guarantee that you can take to court and say, you promised that you would defend Estonia against the Russians. No, it's whether the Estonians or the Germans or the Greeks believe that America will come to their aid. And I will tell you that, in my opinion, there is not one American. Rather, there's not one European. There's not a member of NATO, including Canada, who thinks that America is going to come to their aid. If I were living in Estonia right now, I would be very, very worried, right? That has already gone. So NATO's conceptual depth, the conceptual depth of Article 5, gone. Now, whether NATO develops, as many European members of NATO have been trying to work at meetings where Marco Rubio is conveniently absent, to try to figure out a way of dealing with a strategic autonomy, as the French would call it, or even a kind of a Gaullism to deal with the issues that they think are important. We don't know that. It's too early. We don't know whether NATO as an organization can make the adaptation to this new world. NATO is a very, we always used to tease it, it was a dinosaur. It is a dinosaur. It moves very slowly. Those people in NATO, especially those members of the American military establishment, are trying to figure out how to modernize it. Not only modernize it for modern warfare, but modernize it as a new kind of alliance in an era where the president doesn't believe in allies, right? For me as an American diplomat, this is so fundamentally mind-boggling that I often compare myself to the people I remember who worked in the communist government here in Czechoslovakia in 1989 who said, oh man, what am I going to do now? I'm so grateful that I'm no longer a diplomat. I do not know what I would do now if I were dealing with security issues with this evaporation, not of NATO as a thing, but of NATO as a spirit, NATO as an idea that is welding together people in this way. So we have a president who doesn't believe in allies, fundamentally doesn't think that having allies gives you leverage, which I would argue gives you enormous leverage. And I think that it is a matter of time now where a couple of things will happen, my predictions. First of all, the Europeans will try to figure out, under people like Merz, under people like Macron, even under people like Meloni, they will try to figure out how do we make either make NATO into something or find something else that will allow us to try to have a credible, some sort of credible defense. They're not there yet. And I think this will go on now. The other place that you don't hear much about is in the American uniformed military. There's a deep gap now between the civilians running the Defense Department and the people who are the uniformed military, the senior officers in the American military. And the senior officers in the American military are deeply concerned because they have been brought up in a tradition of believing that they are stronger through their alliances. I don't know if we are ever going to get to a point, one that we've never had in America, where there is such a big gulf between the civilians and the military that it becomes an open problem. That has never happened in America, to my knowledge. But something like that is possible. Final thing I'll mention to you is that there was a report that was prepared by the two people who are responsible for the so-called DOGE, the reinvention of government, working in the State Department. And the report that was leaked to the press says that the government should ask, the Trump administration should ask for allocations for the State Department, which budget is now about $50 billion, that they should ask for $24 billion. That's less than half of the State Department. All funding for NATO, cut off. All funding for the United Nations, cut off. Fulbright program, cut off. That is to say, what has happened to USAID, that was only the beginning. So if you're trying to figure out where NATO is going to be, you have one problem in trying to figure out what kind of ideas are going to turn out. The other problem is if you starve NATO, if you don't have any money, there are no German, Italian, Portuguese planes that can fly C-5A lift across the ocean. That capacity doesn't exist without the Americans. And if the Americans are not funding NATO, that is the operation, the administrative operation of NATO, this effort that the Europeans are going to make is going to be very difficult. So if I haven't made myself very clear, if anything, I'm more worried than he is.
Well, I hope for the best, but we Europeans must prepare ourselves for the worst. America as a European power has been here since 1941, in fact. So it's going to be 85 years next year. America will celebrate 250 years of the Republic next year. So only 1/3 of American history was America deeply involved in Europe. By the way, in the 20s and 30s, the Woodrow Wilson intervention in European Great War was considered a mistake by most Americans in the 20s and 30s. So Trump will not be president forever. There will be other presidents in the future who could change the course, who could see that alliance with Europe is good for America as well. That's the hope, but we must prepare for the worst. And what is that? In 1990, when the Cold War ended, American defense expenditure inside NATO were 50% of all NATO countries' expenditures. 50%, and 50% were expenditures by West Europeans. Now, after several rounds of NATO enlargement, American defense expenditures, until recently, among NATO countries were 75%, and all Europeans only 25%. That was our fault, our European fault, not Trump's fault, not J.D. Vance's fault, our fault. I remember late June 2011. Then American Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, the last Secretary of Defense of George W. Bush, and the first Secretary of Defense of Barack Obama presidencies, warned us Europeans. One day there will be no will among American people to help you if you yourself are not willing to help your defenses. And what's the preparation for the worst? We Europeans, at least those willing countries, must rearm ourselves, and quickly, in order to achieve the goal that we Europeans alone, without America in worst case scenario, are able to contain Russia. We must prepare for that we Europeans alone, without America. If America helps, that's great, that would be great. But we must prepare that we will be able to contain Russia alone. And nobody expects that we will help America to contain China. And Americans know that they will be alone. Maybe some like-minded allies like Australia, Japan, maybe India, no one knows, could help to contain China if Chinese go aggressive. So what does it mean to be able to contain Russia ourselves on our own? 5% of GDP, that's ridiculous. That's not viable, that's not realistic. But what's realistic is to pay the same amount, the same percentage of GDP as the United States pay, which is now 3.4. In 2 years, that's doable. 3.4, and then it cannot be said that the Americans are paying for our defenses and that we are free riders. If the percentage of defense spending is the same, 3.4, that would be great. That would be great. And the last thought, well, there are American nuclear weapons in Europe. in several countries: Britain, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. Turkey is Asia. And there are only 2 European countries which have their own nuclear deterrence weapons: United Kingdom and France. I don't think those will be the only 2 countries in Europe in coming years. I think that Polish people, regardless whether Polish liberals or conservatives, but Polish consensus will be that one day, quite soon, they need to have their own nuclear deterrent. And that will happen, and that will be good for us Europeans, I think.
Thank you, Roman. So, George?
Thank you. So, to go back to the idea of allies, I think for many of the same reasons why, or that I raised about the tariffs, Trump doesn't like the idea of allies because there is that limiting factor. You cannot do whatever you want if I need to take into consideration the views and advice and interests of another actor as an equal. So I think that just kind of, again, built into him personally, there is that limitation. NATO's purpose was said to be, at the beginning, to keep the Germans down, the Americans in, and the Russians out. The Americans are leaving, the Germans are rising, and the Russians are knocking. So I think that NATO's original purpose is severely damaged. When it comes to Article 5, the idea of collective security and of Article 5 is that Article 5 itself is supposed to be the weapon. Article 5 is a psychological weapon. Are you willing to risk the entire might of every NATO member in a gamble about whether or not Article 5 will hold? As long as there's belief in Article 5, there should be effective collective security, meaning there shouldn't be any kind of attack, there shouldn't be any kind of test on the frontiers. As belief in that erodes, it's not just a question about whether the Estonians would believe that America would come to their defense, or the Poles, or the Slovaks, or anybody else. Would the Russians believe that the Americans would come to the defense of a European NATO member? And belief in that is severely, severely crippled, I would say, at this point. Marco Rubio can say all he wants that, yes, NATO is important, and yes, America believes in NATO, America's a part of NATO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when the commander-in-chief, the legal authority over the military, is blaming Ukraine for Russia invading it, and when Trump is saying that, again, you need to pay up or I won't necessarily defend you, if you introduce doubt that there are whatever circumstances that you will not abide by Article 5, then you are destroying that psychological weapon, and you are making a test of Article 5 more likely to happen. So I think that this is incredibly dangerous and damaging, just what has been done in the first term, in the campaign, and certainly in the beginnings of the second term. And the tariffs, I think, kind of add on to that. So before the tariffs began, you had Secretary Hegseth and Vice President Vance come to Europe and basically beat up on America's allies, saying that you are a problem, you're not democratic, you are too weak, and we're done saving you. And then they leave. And weeks after this, you have the introduction of tariffs, which are designed to cause economic pain to your allies, the ones who would need to have a strong economy in order to help defend themselves, the rest of the alliance, and the United States should a war break out. We've seen with Russia and Ukraine that unless things quickly escalate to a nuclear war, you're going to have more of an old school kind of protracted industrial war that is going to need to have healthy economies with healthy industrial bases that can keep up weapons manufacturing. And the tariffs are going to severely curtail that ability to have a war effort should it be necessary. what would happen in Europe, or what is likely to happen in Europe, I think if Germany continues on the course that it is on, I think that it is going to quickly make itself a natural new pole of power in Europe. France and Macron can talk about what Europe should do and shouldn't do and what it can do, and France will lead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Germany's, within a matter of weeks, completely changed its position also from the last 80 years, is going to station troops on a European allies' territory, is going to ramp up military defense spending, is going to try to ramp up its military capacity in terms of personnel. And I think whatever happens on paper with NATO, Germany is going to be the new pole of power in what Europeans' security vision is like. And I think that the time will come when the US, whether it's with Trump or someone else, is going to want and need Europe's support. The idea that it would just be an American war with China, it won't be that isolated. Russia will take advantage of whatever's going on in the Pacific to do what it wants in Europe. And so it would be to their benefit, again, to come together. Whether or not the politics and animus would allow for that or would delay it, I think this is something that could be further damaging.
Thank you very much, Ondřej.
Just listening to my wise colleagues here, I wonder if I should pack tonight or if I can leave it until tomorrow. Allies. I think the Trump team have no respect for Europeans' judgment of risk and of the danger that they find themselves in. They see that Europe was dependent for energy on Russia. That's number one. Number two, Europe is still very dependent on export to China. In fact, as we discussed all the political angles running through the minds of people in Washington, I think China is really the key enemy, the key country which we should not forget about. And what I sense is that there is resentment at the Europeans for expecting the Chinese to bail Europe out and to divert some of their exports in that direction. The European Union, or Ursula von der Leyen, commissioned two very important studies. I'll mention the one from Mario Draghi, who addresses the question of integration within Europe itself. And there's a very nice IMF study that shows that the non-tariff barriers among the European states are equivalent to about 40% tariffs on goods and 110% tariffs on services. So Europe has quite a long way to go to integrate. I would suggest that the two key areas that it should focus on are not in the area of economics, but in policy. And they relate to foreign affairs and security. I think if you wanted to form a confederation of states, an alliance of the willing, it should cover those two areas and the very important border or immigration policy, which seems to be the source of so much trouble and so much political turmoil within Europe. So I have no idea whether Trump will show up at the NATO summit in June. My guess would be that he will probably not. But the demand for 3.4 or 3.5% will certainly be made from the US. It's not a question of only money, it's a question of capability. We hear almost daily about Oreshnik missiles landing on Kiev and many other Ukrainian cities. But if they headed towards Prague, how many could we shoot down here? Probably none. And so I think we're in a situation where the American team to NATO comes with the realization that people in Europe do not understand geopolitics, do not understand risk, and do not understand the gambles that they're taking, that they're basically immature and incapable of being trusted in this area. And that is, unfortunately, the reality. Now, how much of the alliance survives? I defer to my wiser gentleman here. I think the attempt will be to solve it through money. When I hear this idea that Germany should play the organizing role, I agree. It's the most natural thing to happen. But you do have history here. I mean, all the neighbors of Germany, including this country, Poland, France, have a certain aversion, which I wonder if this can be overcome in the politics in some sort of arrangement that would deal with the issue that you very correctly raise. And Cameron, you scared me.
Thank you.
On that note, I think Vance's comments in the Munich summit were very concerning, and I'm not even European. I'm American, and I was taken aback because of the history that the Czech Republic, Poland, France, and other various countries have experienced from having American diplomats, high-level American diplomats, the vice president, say it's on you. And for Europeans, location matters. It isn't going to be Williamsburg, Virginia, that has only been around for a few hundred years. These are places that have transpired into not only, I would say, locations of discourse, but also memorable moments, I would say. And I think that NATO is currently at a crossroads of integrating the United States further, or rather trying to integrate, or completely disassociating itself and not involving them whatsoever. To me, I think NATO is kind of like the high school groups. It is, oh, Group A does this, Group B does this, Group C does this. Do we all get together or not? And I think Group A and Group B are going to be Europe, they're going to be Germany, they're going to be perhaps Italy, they're going to be Poland or France. With regard to George's comment, I don't even think that France has the capacity or capabilities to lead. I think that it is going to be Germany. Maloney also has said some very strong things and has a very clear path to what she wants to obtain. And I think that that could also be a potential successor to the United States. With regard to the comment of allies, Jan, I think the United States doesn't want any. I think that at this point they are entirely okay with being isolationist and being nationalistic, and they don't need anyone. And I think that the viewpoint of the 1980s, the Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall, Great Depression, is everyone's back minds. No one really puts two and two together and views it chronologically. I think that the end result for NATO will not be good. I think that NATO is a spirit. It is just an idea, figment, I don't want to say figment of the imagination, but it is a figment of someone's mind. And it's more so how to convince someone that that mind and that figment is true, and that we can hold truth in that. And at the end of the day, the future of NATO does lie in Ukraine and Russia's war. It does lie in Eastern Europe. And to your point of missiles coming over to Prague, hopefully not. I have a package coming tomorrow. I'd like to receive it. So I don't know. I think the United States' dedication to NATO, without a doubt, is waning. But as Romain said, the capabilities ultimately outweigh the economic factors. 3.4%, I don't think any European country could eventually do that. A couple weeks ago, United Kingdom said that they're going to raise its defense by 0.2%, I think. And that would only bring them to roughly 2.8. And that was major news, supposedly, was that 0.2% an increase in defense spending. So I think the attitude will lie in Central Europe. I don't think that any of the continental states around Central Europe will be able to play a role, but the future of NATO is at a crossroads. So perhaps Germany, perhaps France, perhaps Italy can make NATO great again.
Thank you. So, yes, just technical.
Sorry. I just wanted to kind of continue on something that you said. It's kind of not fair that I can only talk for things going that way. I agree with several of the points that you made, and I think it's important to stress that with the Libya operation under the Obama administration, Obama basically said, you Europeans want to do this, this is in your interests. We're not going to kind of be the lead. We will be the infrastructure that you need because you don't have the infrastructure. And so the United States, as part of the alliance, provided that kind of force infrastructure. And even with that, in the news I can still remember, there was discussion about these various European NATO members, these pilots who are more or less flying unaccosted and launching their attacks, running out of weapons, becoming exhausted and fatigued, not being able to keep up with this kind of operation. The idea that you could defend against Russian missiles or Russian planes or something else after having 4 years of battle experience, I think is problematic as well. So yes, it's not just the money, it's what you do with the money, it's the capabilities, it's the training, and that would all need to be started quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think now we should mix it a little bit. Let's speak for a while about the values. We have a whole spectrum of opinions. Some people think that we should be even worried about the state of American democracy inside. Some people say let's wait and also we should be also worried about our state of democracy in Europe, as J.D. Vance said. Like if you look at the elections in Romania and this and that, and some people believe that before, with this all these like wokeism and progressivism and cancel culture, etc., that it wasn't exactly some shining city of the hill either. So I know that Ondřej has some letter which was sent to Harvard University from federal government. So perhaps we could start with you. Like, what's your take on this briefly?
Well, before I get to the Harvard issue, actually there's a connecting theme, and I liked what my colleague here mentioned about isolationism sort of creeping in. If you read George Washington's farewell address, it starts there. If you read the Monroe Doctrine, it continues. And the exception is really Woodrow Wilson and FDR. So Europeans who keep saying, you know, our common ideals is what binds us together, if you look at sort of the span of US history, most of the European immigrants ran away from Europe and from various despotism, whether religious or revolutionary, etc. And the founding fathers issued a clear warning. So allies are, for every American, somewhat suspicious, unless you're a diplomat. What came as a total surprise, obviously, is the speech that J.D. Vance delivered in Munich. I was shocked, as I think most people were shocked. But if you parse it carefully, there's unfortunately quite a bit there to be unpacked. And it does lead to what the federal government under Trump has set in motion, not just dismantling USAID, but attacking the cultural norms that have taken root in US institutions. Notice that Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, where I had the privilege of teaching very shortly, is no longer called the Woodrow Wilson School. It's been renamed School of Public Policy or a Princeton School of Public Policy. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson fell out of favor. He was a racist, and his statue was taken down. His name was taken down from the university, and it's all part of this woke culture that led up to some of the protests on U.S. campuses in the wake of the October attacks in Israel, where pro-Palestinian groups took over some classrooms, staged protests that essentially made teaching impossible, research and functioning of the university impossible. And now the people in Washington are trying to force some corrective changes at the university level. And they're doing it in such a terrible way that basically, well, we know that law firms have buckled. They basically signed up to the Trump plan and they said, yes, we will give you free pro bono work, helping you draft some of these trade deals. Many universities, I think the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia, were also deprived of some of their federal funding, and they went quiet. And I'm very proud to say that my alma mater is the first one that stood up, where Harvard president sent out to all people at the university, or all alumni, people connected to the university, the reasoning for refusing what the federal government is doing. Harvard and all of these elite institutions are private institutions. They do not have a charter from the federal government. They are to pursue excellence and research and knowledge according to their own rules. And all alumni vote every year for the governing board. So if you look at the governance of the university, it's really independent. And the question is, what can the federal government impose on such an institution in the way of diversity, in the way of blindness in admissions, in hiring procedures, etc. It goes very deep into essentially First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. I'm not going to trivialize it or summarize it in any way. I urge you to look into it because I think this is a very important subject, and it's the subject that J.D. Vance, as a lawyer, educated at Yale, is very close to. And the strong words he used in Munich were very much in that setting. So that's just for a start. I will leave it to others to speak to it.
Okay, thanks. I would give the floor to Roman now because I know he has to leave a bit.
Yes, I will have to leave by 7. America, Canada, European nations, Australia, Taiwan, Israel, those are all democracies with reasonable freedom of speech, freedom of religion, with several political parties who compete in elections, and elections are mostly fair and free. So I wouldn't say that there is a huge gap concerning values between America and Europe. Of course, there are differences. Some differences, which is normal. It would be abnormal that all democracies would have completely identical political systems. That would be something strange. So, for example, in America, the guarantees for freedom of speech are more solid and more classical liberal or libertarian than in any European country concerning the government. But if we look at non-governmental institutions like universities, in the past, on many even important American universities, there were no strong guarantees for freedom of speech. For example, conservative guest lecturers were shut down by radical students, were prevented to speak, And universities did nothing in favor of free speech. On the other hand, in Europe, or at least in this country, we have free debates on our universities. You can hear and listen to many different political points of view. So that's one difference. And now concerning Romania, well, I am not happy with what happened in Romania. We shall see what will happen next in Romania. Of course, it's problematic, but that has happened many times in European history. If we look at the finest hour of Britain, since summer 1940 till summer 1941, only United Kingdom, only Britain resisted a Nazi domination of Europe. Who were the best allies of Britain in that year? Well, Greek military dictatorship. And Salazar, dictator in Portugal, nominally neutral, but aiding Britain. And the democracies in Europe, like Sweden and Ireland and Switzerland, did not help at all. During the Cold War, you had many dictatorships who were firmly anti-totalitarian, anti-communist, than many democracies. During the 60s and 70s, Democrats like Trudeau, Father Trudeau in Canada, or Olof Palme in Sweden, they were not very helpful in the Cold War struggle to contain Soviet Union. And some dictatorships were more helpful, let us say. So I don't advocate a return to authoritarian regimes in Europe. I wouldn't like to do that. I'm worried by what has happened in Romania. But J.D. Vance, a person who is not capable of publicly declaring that Donald J. Trump lost elections legitimately, fair and square, in 2020, he is entitled to lecture us on our bad democracy? I would say that's ridiculous. So we have not perfect pro-democracy positions either in Europe nor in America, but I would not overestimate the badness or wrongness of our democratic systems. They are decent. In America, in Canada, in Europe, in Israel, on Taiwan, in comparison with the alternatives. They don't have anything like that in Russia, or in Saudi Arabia, or in, and I can go on and go on. So we should try to be better Democrats, of course, but both in Europe and in America.
Thank you very much, George.
Thank you. I think that it might be helpful to separate, when we talk about shared values, looking at leaderships, looking at governments, and looking at people. I think it's quite clear that the American leadership now either does not share values or has even different values or countering values to those of European democratic governments. I do not think that J.D. Vance has a leg to stand on when it comes to free speech. He is not interested in free speech. He's not interested in the persecution of conservative speech. If he cared about free speech, then there wouldn't be people being deported because they protested. There wouldn't be people being sent to prisons in other countries simply because their presence as an individual who came from a different country is seen to be threatening. This isn't about free speech. It's about a particular kind of speech that is believed to be right and empowering and should be further empowered. So I disagree that J.D. Vance cares about free speech. But looking at people, I think that a convenient way or a convenient adjective to describe American people's views is isolationist. But it's not really isolationist. It's that they are concerned about their experience. It's not that they're anti the world necessarily. It's that their world of their experience is large enough that that is what they are concerned with. And my experience with American people of every political stripe and age is that the vast majority of them are good people who care about their communities and care about people who need help in the world. And when given the opportunity, they will personally involve themselves in doing those things. With that said, They're open to simple messages with simple answers for complex problems that they don't spend the time thinking about or considering the consequences of. So, yeah, if we're paying for European security and they're not paying their fair share, then obviously something's wrong. And if they're not going to pay, then we shouldn't be sacrificing our hard-earned tax dollars to do it. If you rephrase the discussion, if you rephrase the problem, if you give more information, the views change. So I think when it comes to isolationism, the American people aren't so much isolationist as just their view is different from that of people who, again, you know, the joke, I guess, is that in America you can drive for 12 hours and be in the same state. In Europe you drive for 12 hours and everybody's speaking differently and the cheese has changed. It's a different kind of view of your immediate world, and the European view has an overlap of your immediate world and the broader world that the American experience doesn't have. But in terms of shared values among the people, in terms of democratic values, you can watch any of these town halls, these videos of town halls that have happened in the last few weeks and months. There's a huge interest in democracy at the local level, at the state level. There's huge interest in the idea of fairness, which when you take away from political slogans and campaigns, usually translates to nobody should be unduly harmed, nobody should be unduly restrained, and people deserve to have a fair amount of help and a fair shake at doing and living their lives, which isn't so very different from people in Europe either. So I think that whatever leaderships may be in America, in Italy, in Germany, I think that those values are very much shared because of that most recent, you know, close to 100 years, more than 100 years now, of shared history and in defense of this idea of democracy and liberalism.
Thank you very much. Cameron?
Very much agree with this point, and just a smaller kind of, I guess, a grace note that I would put on that is, when you think of these common people, we also have to think that the context within which both Europe and America are living, whether it is the change in the media landscape, whether it's the change in the economic structure of our lives, mean that these people who are fundamentally good people, and fundamentally good for the same reasons, because they have basically been raised in an atmosphere that generally prizes tolerance, even if it's not always tolerant in the same way, or generally prizes, you know, equality, liberty, justice, these kinds of things. They are also susceptible, and this is the point I would make, which is, I'm afraid to say, I've been the downer in this, and I'll be downer again. Under pressure, people then look to other solutions, whether even good people, even, you know, my friends who live in Kansas who voted for Trump, you can imagine I don't live in Kansas and I didn't vote for Trump. They went a different way. And what I'm afraid of is what is happening in the United States and the way it's being received in Europe and in Japan and in Australia may lead our democratic European friends, our democratic allies, or perhaps former allies, to look for solutions that the unpredictability of the Trump revolution does not anticipate. And the one that I think of the most is that if you kick the Europeans in the teeth enough times, they might say, I would rather deal with a country that is perhaps less democratic, but at least predictable, than the United States. And that country is China, right? And I think one of the big debates that's going to be coming up in the future is, do we trade, and I don't mean to put this in an absolute sense, but do we trade our pride and our values for the security, and the Chinese believe in nothing if not security, for the security of having people who don't change their mind about their policy of trade and markets, people who say we are not going to mess with your internal issues, right? Now, whether they do it or not is something else, but you know what to expect with the Chinese, and increasingly you don't know what to expect with the Americans. This is something that concerns me. And it's not a question that there aren't fundamental democratic impulses here. I've spent a fair amount of time in China, And there are actually a lot of people who have fundamental democratic impulses in China. They keep them to themselves. But there are people around the world who share those things, those desire for freedom and for fairness. But when at a macro level, that which you are used to changes so radically, and the unpredictability and the hostility that you get from the United States comes, it would be, I think, a shock to many people in the Trump administration if the result of what Trump does leads Europe to be closer, for example, to China.
Thank you, Cameron. Can I have a special question for you, Drake? Or you definitely can say what you wanted to say, but there is this United States are interrupted the aid and intelligence for Ukraine, but they started to deliver it again, so it's somehow functioning. But on the other hand, there were some moments, especially for myself, which I really felt terrible, that president of a country which is facing Russian aggression was somehow humiliated in Oval Office yesterday. Donald Trump said once again that Ukraine shouldn't have started the war, etc. So America is, for some people, it's becoming like its image is changing quickly, that it's just like another rude superpower. Like it's, and you can do business with it, whatever. You can travel there like a tourist if they let you in, and they have nice skyscrapers. But these days they have skyscrapers also in China and Saudi Arabia, etc. So, did you yourself, like a young student here in Prague, already felt from some of your friends from different nations or from here, like something like that you are not? Did you feel something that you are not that popular anymore or something? Is anything changing? Are people like telling you like what are you guys doing, or is it okay? It's still because I don't want Americans to end up like Russians who are not very popular in Central Europe.
I think that my Czech lessons have definitely increased, and I will be using that more so than English. But I do not feel a specific sort of worry or I don't want to use the word hatred because of its connotations, but I guess lack of understanding, I'd say. I have not felt that. But I do think that the waving of a U.S. passport is something that people should be proudly doing that much. And I, for one, do not, really. So I myself have not felt anything direct, but I do think that moving down the road, moving down the line in the future, that could happen. That could happen where Americans are not going to go to places. I think recently, United Kingdom, Germany, and maybe Italy, or Japan, I'm not sure, have published travel warnings for their citizens going to the United States. Not United States coming there, but for their citizens going to the United States, which, as someone who has traveled somewhat extensively only in Europe, was dumbfounded to hear. I could not believe that that sort of warnings and those sort of publications would be so grievous, kind of, from the United States, but I took a step back and realized, okay, the international scene is responding to what we've done, to what the supreme person should be representing us is saying publicly. With regard to Ukraine, I think that the entire way this administration, since January 20th at 12:01 p.m., is shameful. I think that the attitude of the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, military apparatus, definitely House Republicans and some Senate Republicans, there needs to be recalls for those positions, in my opinion. And I honestly think that this administration will do more harm for the growth of Ukraine, for the inclusion of Ukraine in Europe, than I can think of any other president, more than likely. Not to play the age card, I can only remember 5 presidents clearly, so I do apologize if my references are out of date. But I think at the end of the day, the issue of shared governance comes or shared values in governance ultimately comes down to what us people want and what the government can provide for us. And the idea that international organizations, bilateral, multilateral agreements are the way to go about that, I think is changing. And I think that the riots or the protest in Georgia, Serbia, Romania, other countries is proof that democracy will exist, will continue, and at the end of the day, it's more so how we as citizens of whatever nationality we are, to improve it at the end of the day. I have always said to someone who isn't going to vote or doesn't want to vote, just do it. I don't care what you vote. As American, I don't care if you vote independent, third party, Green Party, Democrat, Republican, communist, whatever it is. But you're one of the very few people in the 196 country world that we live in that is able to vote. With regard to the protests and the cancel culture, for me, the most defining, interesting detail, which is relevant to this, is voter ID laws. For an American, I do not understand why a representative or senator would be against authenticating your identification. I have never voted in Europe. Perhaps I may in 15 years when I get Czech citizenship. But I think it's just what you do. It's like saying my birthday is this day. My name is this. Here's my ID. And the sense of groundswelling for not allowing that in so many states, or changing the voter laws in so many states, I think kind of is contradictory to what democracy should be about. I'm not saying to not allow this person to vote, of course not, but you should be able to prove how you are able to vote, at least. So at the end of the day, Europe, I think, is going to take the lead. The United States Freedom House Index is on the same level, I believe, as Panama and other countries, or as Argentina is, I think. And since 2014, it has gone down almost 20 points. What happened 2 years after 2014? Donald Trump was elected. So I think that after this presidency, and I hope it is a lame duck presidency, that perhaps the world will become more stabilized. But it's not going to be immediate. It's not going to happen overnight. And the future is worrisome, I'd say. To quote Reagan, the future does not belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. And we'll see who's brave.
Thank you very much. Ondřej, you had a technical remark, because I have to open it for questions for a little while.
Well, just to end on a more upbeat note, I think civil society in the US is just waking up. Trump may be a world-sized problem, and he is, but the solution obviously has to be from the US. The attempts to check, to slow down the current administration, Harvard is there. Some Democrats, even some Republicans have questions about the prudence of certainly the tariffs. And I expect that resistance to multiply, to grow in the next months. And certainly by the middle of July, the golf season will be in full swing. So maybe Trump will be playing golf in Florida, and he will be less interested in policy, because if you remember his first term, he sort of disappeared on weeks on end, and we never heard from him. And now he seems to have sort of started on a sprint, but I wonder how long he will be interested in public policy. And so I would be perhaps more optimistic that Americans are basically good people, as has been said, and people are just waking up. What the Democrats messed up in the last elections, if we had met at the beginning of last year, I would never have thought that Trump could be back and elected. But then the Democrats totally skipped the primaries. They basically said, yeah, Biden, okay, until that terrible first debate between Biden and Trump. And Kamala did a great job. I thought she was wonderful, but it was too late. And so Trump had an opening, and now we're stuck in this rut. But if you look at his approval rating, I think it's down to 42% now. It started at 47. And if he keeps going like this, by the summer, it might be the lowest that we have ever seen. So I would not abandon all hope, is the only thing that I just wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. So we have a space for a few questions. If you could please introduce yourself before you ask the question. So, lady here.
Hello, my name is Valentina. I'm not American nor European, so it's definitely very interesting to see, well, interesting and scary to see all of this play out in real time, especially while I study IR and I learn more and more about all of these things. Basically, my question is, we've seen, especially like Latin America and Central America, South America are a big bloc. So, certainly many times they are overlooked or not considered in the situations. But if you take all of that bloc into consideration, it's a big bloc of economies, of people, of armies, and a lot of different political influences that also take action into this. And there have been naturally US allies for most of our story, and the US in previous times has even imposed military dictatorships to ensure that they maintain this bloc. However, I would say even before Trump stepped in, these blocs, like the Latin American bloc, has kind of stepped away a little bit, especially because most of the bloc doesn't agree with the war Israel keeps enacting on Palestine and the US support to that war, and that has kind of weakened relationships. But now especially with all the deportations, with America invading, well, not invading, but sending troops to Panama, threatening to take over the Panama Canal, and then the tariffs, many of these countries are starting to question their loyalty to the US, and many are even turning their aim to China, which, I mean, I would say it's a little bit concerning, but at the same time, shouldn't Europe try to rein in these countries, not rein in, but turn their views into these countries that can be overlooked, but would add a lot of potential to a unifying or a bloc kind of situation, because these are countries that do have power, just are overlooked. And also, would it be possible to, because China, South Korea, and Japan are in talks right now to combat Trump, which is, if you know the history of those countries, is something very particular because those countries do not like each other. So would it even be possible that more countries lean together to fight off whatever is happening right now? So more of like, I'm not saying world peace, but more unity towards fighting off whatever is happening and to balance a little bit of the power that's being shifted right now.
So George, you have a microphone. So I was waiting to hand it off. You and Cameron, I think.
Take the first hit.
Yes, Latin America is a very large area that is of interest, but is not discussed and is not included in discussions as it should be. I think that you mentioned China. I think this is kind of the biggest demonstration of this. China has taken advantage of the world ignoring a critical area. Trump's statement about how the Chinese are taking over the Panama Canal isn't entirely untrue. They weren't taking over the Panama Canal, but they did have a company that had a large stake of ownership in harbors on either end of the canal, which in wartime could have been used. But again, instead of approaching the situation with trying to replace Chinese investment by trying to create benefits in reinvigorating relations, you had bellicose rhetoric of invasions. You know, it's all your fault for the migration crisis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So while the part of the problem may have been recognized, it was really the solution was as fumbled as J.D. Vance with that football trophy. Should the Europeans be involved? I think it would make sense for the Europeans to become more involved again in terms of investment and in terms, especially under the current situation, with economic relations. I think that the Europeans should be cautious about what their engagement with Latin America looks like, because while the Trump administration may talk about China and be concerned about China, I think they would be much faster in condemning any kind of large European presence in Latin America. It just seems to be the kind of trend. But I think certainly for economic investment, infrastructural investment, and building of relations, again, if the Europeans are going to be pushed away by the Americans, I think it makes sense for them to build as many positive relations as possible with as many places in the world as possible.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, the discussions between Mercosur and the European Union are, I think, in part, or have been sped up by exactly what we're talking about here, which is that if you need other alternatives, Europe is an enormous economic powerhouse. And this is another question, whether Europe wants to use that power in ways that they build on their economic and trade power to do other things. That's not what Europe has the EU as an institution has traditionally done. But who knows, this could happen in the future. I think one of the problems that I've always sensed about South America is it's not a thing, it's a collection of things. And by South America, I mean everything Mexico and South. I mean, there's so much diversity. I'm not saying there isn't diversity in Europe, but there's so much diversity and so much disagreement. I mean, you have a lot of people in various countries in the Southern Cone who are very sympathetic to Trump. You know, it's not just people who are saying the Americans are pushing us around. There's some people who say that's what we want, you know. And there are people in the United States who admire various figures who we won't name, you know, in Argentina and Brazil and places like that. So part of the problem is there's not a thing called South America, and that just makes it harder. And the second thing is, I think that you will get more European attention, but whether that will turn into a relationship beyond just expansion of trade, I don't know.
I would just add that if the Europeans don't have enough money for defense, you know, 5% is out of line, and Mario Draghi tells us that they sent $500 billion of investments to the North American market, because that's where the tech companies, the innovation, all the enterprise, the growth is taking place. You would need Latin America to provide sort of more interesting investment area, and I don't know enough to be able to guess whether that's the case. Clearly, Mexico has done reasonably well out of the NAFTA agreements, and I know that Chile has some very special relationships as well, but the others, with some of their authoritarian past, I think it will be a good goal if you can get that way, but I think the Europeans will find it a stretch.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to thank everyone for an interesting discussion this evening. My name is Steve, and I have a couple questions. One on the tariffs, which I didn't hear mentioned. The reason for these corruption is and I mean by that personal corruption of the Trump circle. Is that something you also see in the rationale behind these? And second, do you think that Trump's hostility to Europe is in part because he sees it as a threat? Not only he's just disdainful of it, but he actually sees it as a threat because it is kind of the remaining pole in civil society, democratic society, regulatory environment, these kind of things that he would like to do away with generally.
Yes and yes.
You need a mic for that?
Well, just on the corruption, I think we saw at the inauguration that whole circle of people who were around there. And then when you find out that Apple gets a special treatment, you know, with the tariffs on iPhones being reduced, that you sort of naturally pose the question that you did. And Elon Musk, you know, I mean, he obviously has a conflict of interest that is huge. You could argue that he lost so much in the stock market. The value of Tesla shares is half of what it was right at the moment of election. But maybe that was just an assessment of that he could squeeze even more out of his corrupt position.
Yes, first question. I think that the interesting dynamic between tech companies, specifically Tesla and Apple, and the Trump administration from inauguration, from Elon Musk on a campaign trail, to becoming a special advisor, I think was the specific terminology to Trump, shows you where Trump relies on information. In the very first administration, we always were told he received some one page with bullet points of everything, and that's how he was able to make his decisions. I've heard that this administration, it's basically from X or Truth Social. So I think that every politician, honestly, has a little bit of corruption. I don't think anyone is 100% pure. Maybe Havel, maybe he was. But I think that in US politics, corruption has always been the case primarily since the early 2000s. When we got rid of how much money politicians could receive, how much people could report on their taxes, I think that that opened the floodgates. With regard to your second comment or question, I think Trump has a very interesting dynamic with Europe. He has a relationship from his ex-wife. He has a relationship from his children, from his current wife too. So I think that he understands what the values of Europe are. And I don't think that Europe as a whole is a threat, but I do think that specific governmental institutions and specific organizations based in Europe are a threat to him, like NATO, like WTO, like the United Nations, and I know headquarters are in New York, but they have a lot of operations in Switzerland. But I think at the end of the day, he's not going to view Europe as any sort of threat because it's not where his base is. His base is in Kentucky. His base is in Ohio. His base is in the, well, I would say Midwest, but the middle part of the country. And he doesn't, frankly, give a damn about what anyone else says outside of the United States. But I would like to answer the previous question, if I would be permitted to. I think that BRICS also is playing a major, major role. And with regard to the question of EU involvement, I don't think it's in their capacity. If countries can't provide the 5% bare minimum, as you mentioned, I don't think how they're going to have an involvement. The reason how China and other countries are able to is because it's a very simple process. You need a dam built, we'll give you the money, just give us 100 years of ownership, essentially. And that is the best marketing strategy ever, I think a country could come up with. So the future of Latin America, or South America for that matter, really lies in those specific countries, in those special governments. And I ultimately wouldn't even expect any sort of support internationally. If there's one thing we've learned from the first Trump administration, is that countries need to watch their own backs and they can't rely on anyone else. And I think that will persist until 2028.
Hello, thank you for the interesting discussion. I'm a student here. My name is Guanza, and my concern and more of a note would be this vague connection between the USA, Russia, and China's position in that. Because from my knowledge, what I know and what I've seen, when the US directly in the UN kind of parted themselves with Russia, that was the first international kind of, first of all, shock, and then the kind of predictive thing that what would happen with the alliances. And it's scary because I'm from Georgia, and I had this kind of question to you, because if theoretically and hopefully the war in Ukraine will end, I don't think Russia can afford, with its political, economical kind of system of warfare, I don't think it will stop there. And my predictions would be that they will go in Eastern or Balkan countries. And I would have a question, because this connection from USA and Russia is really scary, because first of all, Trump is unpredictable, as you mentioned. And second of all, I see a lot of patterns closely to Russia, to the decisions from Trump administration. What you mentioned, for example, the dubious and only partial information sources that they base their decisions on. For example, tariffs could be a great example for what happened in war in Ukraine, because I don't think they told Putin what Ukraine was and had in a war. So my question would be, if we will see, which is really hard to see a future of this war situations, which is, unfortunately, we have a lot of wars in world, but do you think China would be, have a big part in the warfare, and where you think USA's and Russia's connection will go on, and if not, do you see this coalition or new, I don't want to say World War III, but the big kind of more sad stories than what we have now? Thank you.
He's got a very pessimistic opinion.
I do have a pessimistic opinion, but I want to make sure I understand the question. China and Russia, can you just crystallize the question? I'm just not sure I understand it. It's really a question for me, what's going to happen in the relationship between Russia and America, because I don't think that, I don't want to make it just personalities, but I don't think that Trump guesses very well with Putin. I think there is a lot of room for misunderstanding. I think Trump is, for example, genuinely puzzled that Putin didn't accept his peace proposal. And I just don't think that they have, despite the bromance that's written about, I think there are still problems there. So it's very hard to predict how this will go on. And most people, I think, are thinking that, you know, there's so much talk about peace. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that Putin wants to stop, or wants to stop without getting a lot more than he is offered now. So that's a question. I just don't know. The question about China, China is very much, in my opinion, a very conservative place. That is, these people don't take big risks. They don't tend to deviate. The example that I remember from years ago is, I'm skeptical that they would invade Taiwan, because they genuinely believe that over the period of the next 20, 30 years, Taiwan will eventually fall into their hands. right? They use this metaphor, like ripe fruit, Taiwan will fall into our hands. So I don't think they have to take big risks. I think they are delighted when they see the mistakes that America is making. And there's the famous dictum that's usually attributed to Napoleon, which is never interfere with your enemy when he's making a mistake, right? And I think the Chinese kind of live this. They say, we're going to watch. We have all the time in the world. Let's see what happens and make our judgments. So I don't see them being activists. I don't see them as saying, let's take a role here. So I didn't answer your first question very well because I just don't know. I have no idea how this America-Russia thing is going to work out. And secondly, count on the Chinese not to do anything.
So thank you very much. So we have to close the debate. I would like to thank the panelists first. Ambassador Munter, thanks for coming. George, thanks, thanks for participating. Ondřej Jonáš, thanks for coming again. And Drake, we especially appreciate your involvement. And I would like to thank all of you for coming and see you at our next debate. And plus, I would like to thank Anglo-American University for helping us and hosting us, and Jiří Schwarz also, and others. And I would like to thank my team in Strategeo on organizing it. So see you at some next occasion, and thanks again for coming and participating.